Some truths don't knock. They walk into the room and take everything with them. The ballroom shimmered under layers of crystal light, each chandelier casting reflections across polished marble floors as cameras hovered like silent witnesses, capturing every breath, every glance, every carefully curated moment of power. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, tailored in a black tuxedo that fit like precision, his voice steady as he addressed a room filled with investors, media, and influence. A man who had built an empire on control, on certainty, on never being caught off guard. And for a moment, everything followed the script, applause rising in measured waves, glasses clinking softly, the quiet hum of admiration wrapping around him like a shield, until the doors at the far end of the hall opened without announcement, and the sound of the latch echoed louder than it should have, sharper than it had any right to be, and something shifted, not loud, not chaotic, just enough for the room to feel it before understanding it. And then she stepped inside. Amara Hayes, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, her presence cutting through the noise without raising a single sound, and the light seemed to find her without effort, settling along the curve of her shoulders, catching in the calm strength of her face, and in each of her hands were small fingers, two children walking beside her, steady, quiet, unaware of the weight they carried into that room, and conversations began to falter, one by one, voices lowering, eyes turning, until the entire space tilted toward her without permission, because there was something about those children, something impossible to ignore, their features so familiar it pressed against memory like a shadow trying to take shape, and Ethan felt it before he saw it, a pause in his breath, a fracture in his rhythm, his words trailing off as his gaze lifted, drawn across the crowd until it found her, and for a second nothing moved, not the cameras, not the people, not even him, because recognition didn't arrive. Gently, it hit like a quiet collision, years folding into a single instant as her face became real again, no longer a memory he could manage, no longer a chapter he could close, and his chest tightened as his eyes dropped, almost against his will, to the children beside her, to the small boy whose stance mirrored his own, to the girl whose eyes held the same sharp calm he had seen in his reflection for decades. And the world narrowed, the lights dimmed around the edges, the noise pulling back until there was only that moment suspended between them, and she didn't rush forward, didn't call his name, didn't break the silence that had once protected her. She simply stood there, grounded, unshaken, letting the truth exist without explanation. And when she finally moved, it was deliberate, each step measured against the marble, as if she had walked this path 1,000 times in her mind, the children staying close, trusting, and Ethan stepped down from the stage without realizing it, drawn forward by something he could not command, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way no one in that room had ever heard before, as he spoke her name like it didn't belong to him anymore. Amara. And she stopped just within reach, her eyes meeting his without softness, without anger, just clarity, the kind that comes after years of silence. And before he could form another word, before he could shape the narrative back into something he understood, one of the children looked up at her, then at him, and asked in a small, honest voice that carried further than it should have, "Mom, is that him?" And the question settled into the air like a final piece clicking into place, undeniable, irreversible, and Amara didn't look away, didn't shield them from the moment. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a single document, and placed it into his hand with a calm that felt heavier than any accusation, her voice steady, controlled, and absolute as she said, "You signed this. You just never thought I'd survive it." The paper felt heavier than it should have in Ethan Caldwell's hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. The ink clean, the signature unmistakable, his name written with the same certainty he had once used to control every outcome in his life. And for the first time in years his fingers tightened without command, his breath slower, uneven, as the room around him shifted from admiration to something quieter, sharper, the kind of silence that watches instead of celebrates. And he looked down at the document again, scanning lines he did not remember reading, clauses he had dismissed as routine, language buried beneath legal precision that now rose to the surface with a clarity that made his chest tighten, because it was not just a contract, it was a record of a moment he had treated as insignificant, a decision made without pause, without empathy, without the understanding that the person standing across from him had been absorbing every word, every condition, every implication, and turning it into something far more powerful than he had ever intended. And when he lifted his eyes back to Amara, she had not moved, her posture still, her expression composed, her silence intact, not defensive, not aggressive, simply present, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said years ago and had only returned to let the truth catch up to him. And the children stood beside her, close but not afraid, their small hands resting naturally against her, grounded in a world she had built without him. And the boy's gaze lingered on Ethan with quiet curiosity, while the girl studied him with a steadiness that felt far older than her years. And something inside Ethan shifted again, something deeper than confusion, something closer to realization, but he pushed against it, instinctively reaching for control, for logic, for structure, his voice low, careful, trying to find a foothold in a moment that refused to give him one as he said, "This is not how this works." But the words sounded thinner than he expected, less certain, and Amara tilted her head just slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just enough to acknowledge that he was still speaking from the version of reality he used to dominate. And when she answered, her voice was calm, measured, carrying just far enough for those closest to hear. "That is exactly how it works." And she gestured lightly toward the document still in his hand. "You built everything on agreements, on signatures, on believing that once something is written, it belongs to you." Her eyes held his steadily. "You just never thought someone else would understand it better." And the words did not rise in volume, but they settled deeper, and Ethan felt the subtle vibration in his pocket, then another, and another, his phone lighting up against the fabric of his jacket, the rhythm irregular, urgent. And for a brief second he ignored it, focusing instead on her, on the reality in front of him that he could not reduce to numbers or strategy. But the vibrations continued, insistent, until the world he had constructed began to intrude on the moment he could not control. And slowly he pulled the phone free, his eyes flicking to the screen, names appearing one after another, his legal team, his chief financial officer, his board, each call layered on top of the next. And the room felt smaller, tighter, the edges closing in as the quiet attention of the crowd sharpened into awareness, because they could see it now, the shift, the fracture, the moment where power was no longer centered where it had always been. And Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked back at the contract, then at Amara, then at the children, the pieces aligning in a way he could not undo, and his voice dropped, almost to himself. "Why now?" And it was not a challenge, not a demand, just a question stripped of everything he usually hid behind. And Amara's expression did not change, but there was something in her eyes. Not softness, not anger, something steadier, something earned, as she answered. Because silence was never weakness. Her gaze flicked briefly to the children before returning to him. It was time. And the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else, because there was no drama, no performance, no need to convince anyone in that room. The truth was already there, standing beside her, breathing, watching, undeniable. And for the first time in his career, in his carefully constructed life, Ethan Caldwell stood without an answer, holding a document he had signed, facing a reality he had created, and realizing that control, once absolute, had quietly slipped beyond his reach. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and sharp, as if the entire room was waiting for something to fall into place. But nothing did, not yet, and Ethan Caldwell stood there with the contract still in his hand, the edges now slightly bent under the pressure of his grip, his phone vibrating again, louder this time in his awareness, impossible to ignore, and slowly he lifted it back up, his eyes scanning the notifications with a precision that had once made him untouchable, but now each message felt like a crack forming beneath his feet. Legal flagged, compliance breach, immediate review required. And his jaw tightened as he opened one message, then another, his thumb moving faster, his breath quieter, controlled but strained. Because the language was clear, too clear, the clause buried deep within that agreement had not just protected Amara, it had positioned her, given her leverage over a segment of his company he had assumed was secure, and for the first time he understood that this was not a Confrontation built on emotion. This was structure, design, patience, and he lifted his head again, looking at her with a different kind of focus now, not confusion, not dismissal, but recognition, because she had not come here to accuse him. She had come here prepared, and the shift in his posture did not go unnoticed. The room felt it, the subtle change in energy. The realization that this was no longer a private history unfolding. This was something that could move markets, alter reputations. And every camera in that ballroom leaned closer without physically moving. Every observer suddenly aware that they were witnessing a moment that would not stay contained within these walls. And Amara remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides now. The children close. The boy glancing up at her briefly as if checking for direction, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod, the kind that did not draw attention but held meaning. And Ethan saw it, saw the quiet trust, the life that had continued without him. And something flickered across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but not entirely hidden, and he spoke again, his voice lower, more measured. You planned this, and it was not an accusation, it was an acknowledgement, and Amara's response came without delay. I survived it, she said, and the distinction settled between them like a line that could not be crossed back over, and he exhaled slowly, his mind moving through possibilities, outcomes, strategies, each one colliding with the reality in front of him, because no strategy accounted for this version of her, this presence, this control without force. And he glanced once more at the contract, at the clause that now felt like a key he had handed away without understanding its value. And his phone rang again. This time not a vibration but a sharp, clear sound that cut through the quiet, and several heads turned, the attention sharpening, and Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Bringing the phone to his ear, his voice controlled but clipped, yes, and the response on the other end was immediate, urgent. His legal counsel speaking quickly, outlining exposure, risk, immediate action required, and Ethan's gaze lifted slowly to meet Amara's again as he listened, his expression tightening, not with anger but with the realization of scale, and when he ended the call he did not lower the phone right away, he simply stood there, holding it, as if the weight of everything had shifted into that single object, and around them the room had fully changed now. The earlier elegance replaced by a quiet intensity, conversations hushed, eyes fixed, no longer spectators, but witnesses, and Ethan finally spoke, not to the room, not to regain control, but directly to her. What do you want? And it was the question he had always used to define negotiations, to reduce complexity into terms he could manage, but here it landed differently, stripped of authority, carrying something closer to uncertainty, and Amara did not rush to answer. She let the silence settle again, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and when she spoke her voice was calm, unwavering. I already have everything I need, she said, and her eyes moved briefly to the children, then back to him. This is not about taking anything from you. And that was when the weight of it shifted again, because it was not a threat, not a demand, not a negotiation. It was something else entirely, something he could not redirect or contain. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, Ethan Caldwell understood that he was not standing at the center of this moment. He was standing inside of it, and it did not belong to him. The air did not return to normal after her words. It shifted again, quieter but heavier, as if the entire room understood that whatever came next would not be undone by applause or explanation. And Ethan Caldwell lowered his hand slowly, the phone still resting against his palm, his attention no longer split between messages and perception, but fully anchored in the reality standing in front of him. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because every instinct he had built over years of control told him that speaking too quickly would expose something he could not afford to reveal. And yet the silence itself was already revealing it. The hesitation, the recalculation, the unfamiliar ground beneath his feet. And Amara Hayes did not fill that space for him. She did not soften it or redirect it. She allowed it to exist, steady and unbroken, her presence unchanged, her posture aligned with something deeper than confidence, something closer to certainty. And beside her the children remained close, their attention shifting between the adults and the room, sensing the gravity without fully understanding it. and the girl's fingers tightened slightly around her mother's hand, not in fear, but in instinct, and Amara's thumb brushed lightly against her knuckles, a quiet reassurance that did not interrupt the moment, but grounded it. And Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now, the small details he would have once dismissed, the way she carried herself, the way the children leaned toward her, the way the room leaned toward all of them, and something inside him began to reorder, not collapse, not yet, but shift in a way that could not be reversed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not weakened, but stripped of its usual distance. "You could have come to me," he said, and the statement hung there. Incomplete, uncertain, because even as he spoke it, he seemed to recognize the flaw in it, the assumption that he had been available, that he had been reachable, that he had been someone she could come to. And Amara's gaze did not harden, it did not soften, it remained exactly as it had been, clear, unwavering. And when she answered, it was with the same calm precision that had carried her through every step of this moment. "You were never there to come to," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no raised emotion, just truth, and it landed harder than any argument could have, because it left no space for defense, no angle to reframe, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as the words settled, his eyes dropping for a brief second before returning to hers. And around them the room continued to hold its breath. Conversation suspended, attention sharpened into focus, because what was unfolding was no longer about spectacle, it was about clarity, and clarity had a way of cutting deeper than anything louder. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders adjusting almost imperceptibly as if he were trying to find a new balance, a new position within a reality that no longer aligned with the one he had built. And he looked again at the children. Really looked this time, not as an extension of shock or recognition, but as individuals, as lives that had existed entirely outside of his awareness. And the boy met his gaze for a moment, curious but not reaching, not searching, simply observing, and the distance in that small moment carried more weight than any words could have, and Ethan swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, before his eyes returned to Amara. And when he spoke again it was quieter, almost measured against something internal. "How long?" he asked, and she understood the question without needing clarification, because it was not about time and years. It was about everything that had happened within that time, everything he had missed, everything he had not known, and she answered without hesitation, "Long enough to build a life that does not depend on you." And the simplicity of it shifted the ground again, because it removed him from the center entirely. Reframe the narrative in a way that did not revolve around loss or revenge, but around growth, autonomy, and choice. And Ethan felt it, the full weight of that realization settling into place, because for the first time he was not being confronted with what he had done, he was being shown what had happened without him. And that difference was something he could not control, could not rewrite, could not negotiate. And his phone buzzed again in his hand, but this time he did not look at it, he did not move. He simply stood there, facing her, facing them, as the quiet truth of the moment expanded beyond anything he could contain. And for the first time in his life, the absence of his influence was not a gap to be filled, it was a reality to be faced, and he had no immediate way to change it. The moment did not fracture into chaos. It settled into something more dangerous, a quiet recognition that spread through the room like a slow ripple. And Ethan Caldwell stood there, no longer the center of attention by design, but by consequence, his presence now defined by what he had not known rather than what he controlled, and the contract in his hand felt less like a document and more like a mirror, reflecting decisions he had made without hesitation, without awareness of their reach, and he glanced down at it once more, not searching for loopholes now, but tracing the language with a different understanding, because every clause that once protected him now stood as evidence of a system he had believed only he could master. And across from him Amara Hayes remained composed, her stillness not passive but deliberate, as if every second she allowed to pass only reinforced the shift already underway. And the children beside her leaned slightly closer, not out of fear, but because the space around them had changed, the energy sharpened, and even they could feel the weight of what was unfolding. And Ethan drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, the instinct to regain structure pushing forward again, but this time it met resistance, not from her, but from the reality itself. And when he spoke, his voice carried less authority and more intention. "You built all of this without me," he said. And it was not disbelief, it was realization spoken aloud. And Amara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as validation, but as acknowledgement of something that had long been true, and the simplicity of it pressed further into him. Because there was no argument to dismantle, no exaggeration to correct, just a life he had not been part of. And he looked again at the children. The boy shifting his weight slightly, the girl watching him with a calm that did not invite or reject, just observed. And Ethan felt the distance more clearly now, not measured in miles or years, but in moments that had passed without him. First steps, first words, quiet mornings, small celebrations, all of it existing beyond his reach, beyond his knowledge, and something tightened in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent, and he lowered his gaze briefly before lifting it again. "Their names?" he asked. The question simple, almost careful, and Amara did not hesitate. "Jordan," she said, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. "And Ava," her fingers brushing gently against the girl's, and the names settled into the space between them, grounding the moment in something real, something human, and Ethan repeated them quietly, not for the room, not even for her, but for himself, as if saying them might close some part of the distance, even if only slightly. And the children did not move closer, did not step back. They remained where they were, anchored in her presence. And that, more than anything, made the boundary clear, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he could no longer ignore, and his phone buzzed again, louder now against the silence. But he did not look at it, not this time, because whatever was happening beyond this room no longer felt separate from what was happening within it. And he exhaled, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension shifting into something more contained, more internal. And when he spoke again, it was different, not an attempt to control, not an effort to negotiate, but something closer to understanding. "I did not know," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room. And Amara's expression did not change, but there was a pause before she answered, a brief stillness that suggested she had heard those words before in different forms, in different contexts. And when she responded, her voice remained steady. "You did not ask." And the distinction was quiet but precise, and it settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not require emphasis. And Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer, the realization deepening. Because the difference between not knowing and not asking was not small, it was everything. And the room seemed to understand it too, the shift moving through the silence, the awareness settling into those watching. And Ethan stood there, no longer searching for a way to reframe what had happened, but beginning, slowly, to see it as it was. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, the question was no longer what he could do to change the situation, but what it meant to stand in it without control, without certainty, and without the ability to undo what had already been lived. The distinction lingered longer than anything else had, settling into Ethan Caldwell with a quiet weight that did not demand attention but refused to leave. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze holding Amara's, as if searching for something beyond her words, something that might shift the meaning, soften the truth. But there was nothing there to reinterpret, only clarity, and the room remained still. The earlier elegance now replaced by a kind of suspended awareness, every person present, understanding that what they were witnessing had moved far beyond a personal exchange. It had become a moment that redefined power without raising its voice. And Ethan's grip on the contract loosened slightly, not because it mattered less, but because he understood it differently now, not as leverage alone, but as a reflection of a decision made in a time when he believed control was permanent. And he exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting in a way that no longer attempted to reclaim dominance, but instead acknowledged the shift, subtle but irreversible. And his eyes moved once more to the children, to Jordan and Ava, standing close to their mother, grounded in her presence. And for the first time his gaze softened, not outwardly, not enough for the room to define it, but enough for the moment to change. And he spoke again, quieter now. "What did I miss?" And the question was not strategic, it was not measured for advantage. It came from somewhere unguarded, and that alone altered the space between them. because it was no longer about what he could regain, but what had already passed beyond his reach. And Amara did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it settle into the silence that had become its own language between them. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried no edge, no need to emphasize, only truth shaped by time. "Everything that matters when no one is watching," she said, and the words unfolded slowly, not rushed, each one grounding the reality she had lived. The mornings when they learned to tie their shoes, the nights when they were afraid and needed someone to stay, the small questions that turn into who they become. And she paused briefly, her eyes moving to the children with a quiet warmth that did not break her composure. The moments that do not make headlines. And Ethan listened without interruption, the weight of each detail pressing against a life he had structured around visibility, around recognition, around outcomes that could be measured and displayed. And for the first time, those metrics felt incomplete, insufficient. And he nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something he could not argue against. And his phone buzzed again in his hand, insistent, urgent, but he did not look at it. Not now, because the moment in front of him had shifted into something he could not afford to miss again, and the room seemed to lean further into the silence. The earlier tension now layered with something deeper, something closer to understanding, and Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, his expression more open than it had been since the night began, and he spoke carefully, as if choosing each word mattered more than ever before. "I cannot change that," he said, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to minimize, just a statement that accepted the boundary he was facing. And Amara inclined her head slightly, not in approval, but in recognition of the truth he had just spoken, and the children shifted subtly beside her, the moment stretching just enough for their presence to fill it again, grounding it, reminding everyone watching that this was not abstract, not theoretical. It was real, lived, carried forward. And Ethan looked at them once more, then back at her, and something settled in his expression, not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of something that did not rely on control. And the silence that followed was no longer sharp, no longer fragile. It was steady, anchored by the truth that had finally surfaced. And for the first time since she had entered the room, the focus was no longer on what had been revealed, but on what could no longer be ignored. And Ethan Caldwell stood there, not as the man who had built everything, but as the man who had missed something he could never rebuild, and understanding that difference was the first shift he could not undo. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, like a space where something new had to be chosen carefully. And Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment longer, his gaze shifting from Amara to the children and back again, as if trying to understand not just what stood in front of him, but what it meant to stand there without the structure he had always relied on. And the contract in his hand no longer felt like leverage or threat. It felt like a turning point he had not recognized when it first crossed his desk, and slowly he lowered it to his side, not discarding it, not dismissing it, but acknowledging that its power was no longer something he could control. And the room, still watching, seemed to sense the shift again, the movement away from confrontation and into something quieter but more significant. And Ethan spoke, his voice measured, not loud enough to command attention, but steady enough to hold it. "Then tell me what I can do now." And the question carried a different weight than anything he had said before, because it was not rooted in strategy, not framed as negotiation. It was a request shaped by the understanding that the past could not be undone, only faced. And Amara did not answer immediately, her eyes resting on him for a moment, as if weighing not his words, but the intention behind them. And there was no urgency in her silence, no need to fill it quickly, because time had already taught her the value of letting things reveal themselves fully. And the children shifted slightly beside her, Ava, glancing up at her mother, then back at Ethan, her expression calm but observant, while Jordan stood a little straighter, his posture unconsciously echoing the man in front of him. And Amara's hand moved gently, resting at the small of Ava's back, grounding both children without breaking the stillness. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying through the quiet without effort. "You start by understanding that this is not about fixing something," she said, and her words did not accuse, they clarified. It is about showing up without expecting to control what happens next. And Ethan listened, his attention fully anchored now, no longer divided by the room or the noise beyond it. And he nodded once, slowly, absorbing the difference between action and expectation, between presence and control, and the distinction settled into him in a way that felt unfamiliar but undeniable. And his phone buzzed again, persistent, but he ignored it completely now, the world. Outside the moment losing its urgency in the face of something more immediate, more personal, and he took a small step forward, not closing the distance entirely, not intruding, but enough to signal intention, and the movement did not startle the children, did not shift Amara's stance. It simply existed, and he paused there, allowing the space to remain, respecting the boundary that had been drawn not by words alone, but by years. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but steadier. "I do not expect anything from you," he said, and the words were chosen carefully, each one placed with intention. "But I would like the chance to be present," and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything he could have constructed before, because it was not a demand, not an assumption. It was an acknowledgement of a position he no longer controlled, and Amara watched him for a moment longer, her expression unchanged on the surface, but there was a shift beneath it, something measured, something that did not rush to accept or reject, because she understood that presence was not proven in a moment, it was built over time, quietly, consistently, without performance. And she glanced briefly at the children, at the life she had shaped with care and intention, and then back at Ethan. And when she spoke, her voice held the same calm certainty it had carried from the moment she entered the room. "Then you will have to earn that," she said, and the words did not close the door, but they did not open it fully either. They defined the path between, and Ethan did not respond immediately, but he nodded, once, firmly, accepting the condition without resistance, because for the first time he understood that this was not a situation he could negotiate into existence. It was something he would have to step into slowly, deliberately, without guarantees, and the room around them remained quiet. But the energy had shifted once more, no longer focused on shock or revelation, but on what would come next. And as Amara adjusted her hold on the children and began to turn slightly toward the exit, not rushing, not lingering, simply moving forward, Ethan did not follow. He did not call out. He remained where he was, watching them take that step away, understanding that this time, the distance between them would not be closed by force or assumption, but by something he had never had to prove before, and that realization settled into him with a clarity that would not fade. She did not rush as she moved, and that was what made the moment linger longer than anything else had that night, because every step Amara Hayes took toward the exit felt intentional, measured, grounded in a life that no longer needed permission to exist, and the soft echo of her heels against the polished floor carried through the room like a quiet statement, not loud, not defiant, just certain. And the children stayed close to her, their small steps steady, matching her pace without hesitation, as if they had always walked forward like this, together, without looking back. And Ethan Caldwell remained where he was, exactly where she had left him, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the distance growing between them, not because he could not move, but because he understood now that movement alone would not close that space. And for the first time in his life, restraint was not a strategy, it was respect. And the room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, the tension easing just enough for quiet murmurs to rise. But no one stepped in, no one interrupted, because whatever had unfolded had shifted something deeper than curiosity. It had redrawn the balance of presence and power in a way that did not require explanation, and Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, looking down at the contract still in his hand. The edges now softened from where his grip had tightened earlier, and he traced the signature once more with his eyes, not searching for escape, but acknowledging the moment it had been written, the version of himself that had signed it without pause, without question, believing the future would always align with his expectations. And now that certainty felt distant, replaced by something more complex, something that required him to exist without guarantees, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling into a new stillness, not rigid, not defensive, but reflective. And when he looked up again, Amara had reached the far end of the room, the doors standing open ahead of her, the night beyond visible in soft contrast to the brightness behind them, and for a brief second she paused, not turning fully, not addressing the room, but adjusting her hold on the children, ensuring they were steady, ensuring they were ready to step forward. And in that small pause, Ethan saw something he had missed before. Not strength alone, but care shaped by years of quiet consistency. The kind that does not demand recognition but builds something unshakable over time. And the realization settled deeper into him, not as regret alone, but as understanding, because what stood in front of him was not just what he had lost, it was what had been built without him, and that distinction mattered more than anything he could say. And his phone buzzed again, insistent, the world outside pressing in with urgency. But he did not answer, not yet, because the moment was not finished, not for him. And as Amara guided the children through the doorway, the light shifting as they crossed the threshold, something in Ethan shifted as well, not visible to the room, not defined by a single action, but present in the way he stood, in the way he did not call after her, did not try to interrupt the path she had chosen, and instead he remained where he was, allowing the distance to exist, accepting it for what it was. And the doors closed softly behind her, the sound quiet but final, and for a moment the room seemed to hold that silence again, not sharp this time, but full, carrying the weight of what had just passed through it. And Ethan stood there alone in that space, no longer framed by applause or expectation, but by the absence of something he could not replace, and slowly, deliberately, he placed the contract against his side, not discarding it, not hiding it, but holding it as a reminder of the moment everything had shifted. And when he finally turned back toward the room, his expression was not the same as it had been at the start of the night. The certainty softened, the control tempered by something quieter, something that would not resolve in a single evening. And as conversations began to rise again around him, cautious and uncertain, Ethan Caldwell understood that what had just happened was not an ending. It was the beginning of something he had never had to face before. And for the first time, he did not try to define it. He simply stood within it, aware that whatever came next would not be shaped by what he could command, but by what he was willing to become. The night did not end when the doors closed behind her. It changed shape, and Ethan Caldwell stood in the center of a room that no longer felt like his. The glow of the chandeliers softer now, the reflections less sharp, as if the light itself had shifted to match the weight that lingered in the air. And conversations began to return in low waves, careful, measured, but none of them reached him, because his attention remained fixed on the space where she had stood, on the path she had taken, on the quiet certainty that had carried her out without hesitation. And for a moment he did not move, not because he could not, but because movement felt insignificant compared to what had just unfolded. And the contract in his hand rested against his side, no longer a tool, no longer a threat, but a reminder, a record of a version of himself that had acted without seeing beyond the immediate. And he lowered his gaze to it once more, tracing the lines not with urgency, but with recognition, understanding now that its power had never come from the paper itself, but from what it represented, a moment of control that had quietly created a future he had not anticipated. And slowly he exhaled, his shoulders easing into a stillness that was no longer about holding position, but about accepting it. And the noise of the room continued to rise around him, distant, disconnected, until a voice broke through, soft but direct, his assistant approaching with careful steps, concern measured in her tone as she spoke his name. And Ethan turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence. And she held out his phone, the screen lit with messages that had not stopped, the world outside still demanding response, still expecting him to move, to decide, to act. And for a second he looked at it, really looked at the calls, the alerts, the urgency pressing forward. And then he closed the screen with a quiet motion, handing it back without a word, because for the first time, the immediate did not feel as important as what had already passed. And the assistant hesitated, then stepped back, understanding without needing explanation. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer before finally turning toward the exit, not with the same pace Amara had carried, not with the same certainty, but with intention nonetheless. And each step felt different, not heavy, but aware, as if he was learning the weight of his own movement for the first time. And when he reached the doors, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the cool surface before pushing them open, and the night air met him with a quiet contrast to the controlled environment inside. Cooler, unfiltered, real, and across the street, just beyond the line of waiting cars, he saw them. Amara standing beside a vehicle, the children already inside, their small silhouettes visible through the glass, and she stood there for a moment, speaking softly to the driver, her posture still composed, still grounded, and Ethan did not call out, did not cross the distance immediately. He simply stood there, watching, understanding that whatever came next could not be rushed, could not be forced into place by habit or expectation. And when she finally turned, her gaze met his across the space between them, not surprised, not guarded, just aware, and the moment held, quiet and unbroken, and Ethan took a single step forward, then stopped, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, respecting the distance she had created, and he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. "I will be there." And the words were simple, not a promise built on certainty, but a commitment shaped by understanding. And Amara held his gaze for a second longer, measuring not the words, but the space behind them, and she gave a small nod, not agreement, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, and then she turned, opening the car door and stepping inside. The movement smooth, unhurried, and the vehicle pulled away moments later, its lights fading into the quiet flow of the street, leaving Ethan standing there, alone but not empty, the night settling around him in a way that felt different than before, and he remained there for a moment longer, watching until there was nothing left to see. And when he finally turned back toward the building behind him, he did not look the same as he had when the night began, because something had shifted beyond what could be explained, beyond what could be reversed, and for the first time, he did not reach for control. He did not look for a way to redefine the outcome. He simply accepted that what mattered now would not be decided in a single moment, but in every step that followed. And as he walked forward, the contract still in his hand, he understood that it was no longer the thing that could destroy him. It was the thing that had revealed who he had been and what he would have to become.